Chairman, conference. Those of you who've watched the media in the last 48 hours or opened your newspapers this morning will know that our gas supplies are already running tight. Those of you who've kept an eye on this issue, and I imagine most of you have, over the last few years have known that we have a looming supply issue, to put it mildly, in power generation. And the two issues are related, and I'd like to explain why. I work for energy-intensive industry, manufacturing that employs over 600,000 people in this country. Export-oriented, and manufacturing, of course, remains the single biggest source of export revenue for this country, and we should never forget that despite what's happened to manufacturing, we have great expertise here and remain the world's 6th or 7th largest manufacturer in GVA terms, depending on whose figures you believe. And we want to hang on to that manufacturing expertise and grow it. But we can't do that. We can't keep the wheels of industry turning if we don't have secure and internationally competitive energy supplies. And what do we need for that? We need a balanced energy policy that makes an appropriate trade-off between security of supply, keeping the lights on and the gas flowing, affordability and competitiveness for industry, whilst of course moving towards cleaner energy supplies over the long run. And who on earth would have a problem with that if we do it rationally and cost effectively? I would argue that we are not, either here or elsewhere in Europe. A quick word about the current gas situation. Contrary to some of the headlines, we're not going to run out of gas in 2 days' time. That alone should not necessarily be a cause for comfort. If we have prolonged cold weather, the margins are getting uncomfortably tight. We have low levels of gas storage in this country compared with every other country in Europe. Traditionally, we didn't need it because the North Sea was our gas storage. But we're heavily import dependent now, which is fine when the imports are flowing from Norway, from continental Europe, LNG from Qatar and further afield, and of course the remaining production from the North Sea itself, which remains considerable. However, as we've discovered in the last 24 hours, events can happen to those links, which risk our supplies here. And our gas prices spiked from around 70 pence a therm up to 90 and then 150 pence a therm briefly 24 hours ago, when there was a disruption to the flow from continental Europe, from Belgium. This is the sort of thing that can happen if you become dependent on imports. Nothing wrong with that, but we need to manage it. We need to have more storage here, so that if there are risks, those imports, it doesn't impact on our security. Now, this wouldn't matter so much if we had a truly liberalised gas market in the rest of Europe. But despite the best efforts of colleagues of yours, such as Roger Helmer in the European Parliament, who pressed for this, we don't yet have a fully liberalised energy market in Europe, and sometimes that can work to the disadvantage of UK consumers. To put it in bluntly, they have access to our gas storage facilities on a commercial basis. We don't have equal access to theirs due to public service obligations and other restrictions. So there's an asymmetry that works to the disbenefit of UK consumers. What happens if we do find ourselves in a gas emergency? Well, we came within less than a day of encountering one in a very difficult winter of 2005-2006. I remember it very well. A number of our members had experienced such high gas prices that they could no longer continue to manufacture chemicals and fertilizer and bricks and so on at a competitive rate. Some ended up closing their factories for as long as 3 months, whilst the prices remained uncompetitively high. And we came perilously close that winter to having to ration gas to industry. So when I say don't worry about your own gas supplies being cut off, in the first instance it's our members, it's industry that will have theirs cut off first. That's the risk to the UK economy. And way before that, we get the prices spiking. And if you think gas is expensive now, think what it could be in constrained conditions here and elsewhere. Of course, that's not a problem they're experiencing in America at the moment, where thanks to shale gas, their wholesale price is a third or a quarter of what it is in the UK right at the moment. We can do something about this in the long run. We can develop our shale gas resources here, and I hope we do. Industry is 100% behind the environmentally responsible production of shale gas. Good for the economy, it's good for the environment, and it's good for our energy security. Now, it is sometimes said that there is not enough government intervention in the energy markets. If only government would get involved a bit more, we'd solve our problems. Well, I can tell you the problem we have is too much government involvement in our energy markets, both here and elsewhere in Europe. And just to give you a short list of the costs that are adding to your electricity bill as a result of climate policies, all of them doubtless well-intentioned. We have the climate change levy, the carbon reduction commitment, the renewables obligation, the small-scale feed-in tariff, the EU emissions trading scheme, the energy company obligation, the carbon price floor, and the prospect of contract for difference feed-in tariffs and capacity payments. All of these are adding to your electricity bill, in addition to other restrictions that effectively stop the market building coal-fired power stations. And if we look to an independent body, he said somewhat sarcastically, the Committee on Climate Change, the Committee on Climate Change, not necessarily a friend of the consumer, has nonetheless admitted in a recent report, possibly they didn't mean to do so, that climate policies of the sort I've just mentioned have already added 21% to a large industrial user's electricity bill. Imagine that if you're a steel company, a chemical company, a cement manufacturer, whatever, that are trying to compete in international markets. Your costs are being raised here, your competitors aren't. But that's just the start of it. All of those costs are escalator costs, and their assessment, the Committee on Climate Change's assessment of the impact, those costs, the climate costs, will have added 58% to industrial users' electricity bills by 2020. The percentage increase will be slightly smaller for us as domestic consumers. I'm sure that makes you feel a lot more relieved. How can Britain compete internationally when it is our government's policy and European policy to drive our energy prices to uncompetitive levels? Well, I'll tell you what's happening. The capital is going elsewhere. We're seeing reinvestment in heavy industry in America on the back of the shale gas revolution there, and it's been an entirely positive thing. Those industries are better managed environmentally and economically than might otherwise have been the case in other parts of the world, and there's therefore an environmental as well as an economic benefit in retaining them within developed economies. This is the carbon leakage argument for those who are worried about the climate change impacts, however large or small they may be, of anthropogenic activity and the CO2 emissions associated with power generation in particular. Moving industry off our balance sheet and onto those of China and India is not a step forward. It damages our economy, it does nothing for the global environment, and it's something we need to address as a matter of urgency. Equally, we have not just carbon targets and renewable targets, but targets for fuel poverty. There is absolutely no possibility of the government meeting the fuel poverty targets, by the way, in this country, unless, of course, the goalposts are moved. So if you were a cynic, you might think they're looking to do just that. But government must take some responsibility for the fact that it's their own interventions that are driving up the price. And just to put some numbers on that, the subsidy to renewables, principally wind, but also some secure renewables that actually work most of the time, is approximately £2 billion per year. £2 billion on everyone's electricity bills. That's set to rise to over £7 billion by 2020. How on earth can we afford that? Indeed, when we signed ourselves up to this target, well, I say we, it was Prime Minister Blair shortly before leaving office, unexpectedly signed us up to a renewable target, the magnitude of which he didn't know what it was going to be, at a European level. That was an £100 billion mistake. £100 billion plus is the capital cost of attempting to meet a renewable target for 15% of all of our energy, which means over 30% of our electricity coming from renewables. Now, even if you're a great fan of renewable energy, we are not going to triple our renewable energy capacity and output between now and 7 years' time, even if the city could spend the money. And as a colleague of mine, an analyst in the city, said, the utility companies couldn't spend that money that fast, even if the city was prepared to lend it to them, and they're not. So we need some realism about that. Even if the government's wind targets were met and we had 25 plus gigawatts of wind on the system, sure, it would generate a certain amount of energy on average, but what good is that? I don't want my lights to stay on average, I want them to stay on the whole time. That means some kind of grown-up power generation has to fill in the gap. So if we are to have more renewables on the system, and let's hope it's the more secure sort, and if in appropriate locations, if there are any, for wind, we can have a bit of that too. But that has to be backed up. And think what it is that's keeping the lights on this winter. Nearly 50% of our electricity this winter has been coming from coal, and a big slug of it's coming from nuclear too. We want to maintain both of those fuels in our mixture, our energy generation mixture for the future, if we're to keep our suppliers sufficiently secure. No reason to fear gas, but it shouldn't be a dominant fuel. And I think the unrealism about phasing out coal is deeply worrying. Of course, they've gone slightly mad in Germany. They're going hell for leather for coal and lignite, shutting down their nuclear power stations and lecturing the rest of the world about climate change, which seems a little bit odd. We'll see how they get on with that. By the way, if you're a German consumer, about half your bill is eco-tax and renewable subsidies. That's where we're heading if we don't reform policy here. So, just to summarize on this, we're going to need a diverse range of fossil and non-fossil fuels if we're going to keep the lights on at an affordable price. We have a particular piece of legislation, the EU Large Combustion Plant Directive, which I know a number of people here are intimately, perhaps even sadly familiar. This requires that a number of our coal-fired power stations are shut down, around 12 gigawatts of coal and oil-fired power stations by 2015 at the latest, or when they've used up 20,000 running hours, and which a number of them have done already. So the coal that has kept the lights on this winter, some of that won't be there next winter, and about a third of it won't be there the winter after that. What is going to plug the gap? On the day the wind isn't blowing, it's not going to be wind. I wish it was nuclear, but that is something for the next decade, we hope. So what is it's going to plug the gap? And it's got to be gas. It's the only thing the industry can build quick enough. It's the only means of providing flexibility to back up wind and to replace the coal that's cutting from the system. But of course, as the energy regulator, Ofgem, has warned, those electricity supplies are only as secure as the gas that's going into those power stations. And this is why we need attention to both. Now, I know that the current Energy Minister, John Hayes, takes this issue very seriously. He's right to. And there are others in government who ought to know better who should listen to him. Because I've always felt, my colleagues in industry have always felt, that the whole point of a sustainable approach to policy is that you have a balance between environmental, social and economic objectives. And what we've had is too much environmental greenstanding, if you like, he says here, inventing a new word, from all the main political parties. Now, I think it's wonderful to dream about clean energy supplies for the future, and it's a great thing to invest in R&D to help bring that about. But let's remember, it was the market that delivered the single biggest environmental benefit in terms of CO2 emissions when we took advantage of cheap North Sea gas to diversify away from coal, incidentally improving our security of supply at the time, and reducing cost to consumers whilst reducing CO2 emissions into the bargain. It was an accident of the environmental benefit, but it was a good one, and that's what's happening in America right now. The second big reduction in our carbon dioxide emissions occurred not because of energy policy, but because we went through the worst industrial recession in living memory. I don't want to see us decarbonise our economy by deindustrialising it, and that's the danger of the way we're heading at the moment. There are all sorts of scary graphs. I thought death by PowerPoint is not a good idea at a party conference or anywhere else, so I've spared you for them. But should you wish to look them up, I can thoroughly recommend Ofgem's charts on what's going to happen to our supply margins in electricity over the next 2 or 3 years and into the end of the decade. And you can see rapidly shrinking margins. Right at the moment, we actually have an oversupplied market, believe it or not by much, but by a bit. So we have too much, if you like, generating capacity, partly because demand has gone down following the recession, both in the domestic sector and, of course, in industry. But if you look at where those supply margins are going to be, there are going to be at least a third, possibly as low as a quarter of that, in 2 to 3 years' time. And there are credible scenarios, and I put it no stronger than this, because scaremongering about power cuts and gas shortages and so on is not constructive. But we need to be realistic too. There are credible scenarios where if gas and power doesn't flow from interconnectors from continental Europe, and it won't do if their supplies are constrained, the wind isn't blowing there, the temperatures are cold there too, as they tend to be in cold weather. There are credible scenarios where we could be facing what's called involuntary load shedding. People will say that's not actually a power cut, but it's a power cut to our members. They're the ones who are going to be booted off the system first, either because they can't afford the power or gas, or because they've had their supplies terminated. That might enable the government today to say, we've avoided a blackout of the sort that apparently Belfast has been experiencing recently. However, it would do immense damage to continuity of manufacture, possibly to manufacturing plant, and the reputation of this country. If we are to remain the world's 6th or 7th largest manufacturer and possibly improve on it, we desperately need to keep the security going, get the prices down, not up, and the last thing we need is a threat to our security supply. So thank you to you for raising these issues. You have industry behind you, and good luck with your campaign.